Hello everyone, welcome to the first week of Introduction to Logic. This week we're really just going to be covering the basics, the very fundamentals of what we're going to be doing here. So because of that, this video might be a little shorter than the videos to come. That said, let's go ahead and jump in. So our reading for this week are going to be chapters 1 and 2 from For All X Calgary edition. If you haven't already seen it, this is our textbook for the course. It's open access, so you can get it for free, either through our Canvas page, where we'll have a link, or in the description to this video below, I'll include a link. They also have made available a solutions manual for the exercises in the book. Most of the exercises in the book are solved there, so if you're looking for a little bit of additional practice, that's a good place to look. That will also be in the description of this video and on Canvas. Okay, so chapters 1 and 2. So first up, we need to talk about arguments. What is an argument? Well, in logic, specifically, an argument is a set of sentences. Specifically, it's a set of sentences where one of those sentences is a conclusion and the other sentences are premises. Okay, so let's break these terms down. Now, again, an argument in logic doesn't really have anything to do with some kind of heated exchange with another person, a dispute, or anything like that. In fact, you can come up with logical arguments all by yourself, no interlocutor at all. It's just about reasoning. It's like a little piece of reasoning. Okay? So it doesn't quite match the colloquial notion of argument. All right. So within an argument, there are at least one, usually more, sentences. A sentence in logic is just a statement that could be true or false. Now, there needs to be a great deal of emphasis placed on this notion of could be, right? So a sentence or a statement gets to count as a sentence even if it's not true, even if you couldn't imagine it being true, right? If it's possible that it could be true or false, it gets to count as a sentence. We'll look at some examples later so you have a better idea of what fits as a sentence and what doesn't. Okay, premises then are special kinds of sentences that are supposed to support some kind of conclusion. They're supposed to give us reasons for accepting a conclusion. Now, you can have arguments that have bad premises. These are premises that don't really do their job that well. They don't really provide much support at all for their conclusion. Nevertheless, they would still count as premises. So a premise, once again, are just sentences that are supposed to provide some kind of support for the conclusion. Now, the conclusion is a special sentence in the argument. In fact, it's the main point of the argument, right? It's the whole reason why we're giving the argument in the first place. It's the claim that you're trying to establish. Okay? So it's the primary claim of the argument. Whenever you see an argument and you need to discern, well, what are the premises? What are the conclusions? Because it's not always going to be clear. The question you should ask yourself, first and foremost, is what are they trying to convince me of? Right? What is the point that they're trying to sell me? That almost always, intuitively speaking, is going to be the conclusion, right? Everything else are going to be premises. Okay, let's look at some practice for sentences. I have several different things here, statements of different kinds, which could or could not be sentences. So remember, a sentence is just a statement that could be true or false. Let's start at the top. There is a man on the moon. Okay, well, at least right now, that seems to be false, right? Well, that's great. That means that it's a sentence. It could be true, or it could be false, right? So that's a sentence pretty clearly. Alice prefers winter to summer. This one's a bit trickier because it's about someone's preference, right? Typically, when we think about preferences, tastes, or opinions, we want to say, oh, well, those aren't facts. Those are different. Well, for our purposes here, it's still the case that they could be true or false. This one, we're reporting about someone else's preference, so it's pretty obvious that this could be true or false. Either Alice really does prefer winter to summer, or she doesn't, right? So it's pretty clear that could be true or false. What if, however, I had said, winter is better than summer? Winter is better than summer. Do you think that could be true or false? Well, it could be, right? Even though it seems like an expression of an opinion, that opinion, theoretically, could be true, or it could be false. And so it would count as a sentence, even though it's an expression of opinion. So don't let yourselves get tripped up there. When we're looking at sentences versus non-sentences, we're not really looking at the difference between fact and opinion. Facts are definitely sentences, but so too are some other things. Okay. What about this? Are there 20 nickels to $1? Well, that's not a sentence, right? It cannot be true or false. Why? Because it's a question. They haven't asserted anything at all. So this, in fact, is not a sentence. What about the next one? All squares have 3 sides. Well, this one's odd, right? Because we know, out of necessity, all squares have to have 4 sides, which means this, it seems like, it can never be true, right? It's an impossibility. So is it correct to say that this is a sentence? Well, yes. Because it can never be true, that means it's always false. And again, if a statement can be true or false, it gets to count. So even when you say things that are weird or obviously wrong, those still get to count as sentences. What about the next one? Clean your room, right? Or shut the door, right? Something like that. Those are not sentences. Why? Because they're like commands. They're imperatives. You're not asserting something that could be true or false. Okay, so not a sentence. What about this last one? Pofferdops squiggly do. Do you think that's a sentence? Well, at the very least, it's not a sentence in English, right? It's not a sentence in the language we are working in. Why? Because the terms don't have meaning. If the terms don't have meaning at all, then it can't be true or false. It's just meaningless. So that's also not a sentence. All right, so as you can see, it's probably easier to be a sentence than to not be one, right? The only things that seem to not count as sentences are things like questions, imperatives, exclamations, things like boo or ouch, right? And lastly, meaningless things that literally cannot be parsed, right? Everything else, it seems to be, gets to count as a sentence. Okay, now that we know what sentences are, we can finally start to look at arguments. And that's what this is all about. Logic is the study of arguments. So this is really what we want to drill in on. Okay, so I have a few examples of arguments here. And our goal is going to be to try to identify what the premises and conclusion are, right? So let's look at the first one. Since every mammal is warm-blooded, whales must be warm-blooded. Okay, it's an argument that has 2 sentences. That means one of them is going to be a premise, and the other is going to be a conclusion. What do you think they're trying to convince us of here? What's the main point of the argument? Well, it seems pretty clearly that they're trying to convince us that whales must be warm-blooded, right? Note the word since. since every mammal is warm-blooded. Since is what we might call a premise indicator. It tells us, hey, a premise is about to occur, right? There are also conclusion indicators. We don't have one here, but some conclusion indicators are things like therefore or it follows that. Right? These are little words that you can look for to sort of help you if you need it. All right, but for this one, we're pretty certain that it's going to be whales must be warm-blooded, right? That has to be the conclusion. In logic, we want to give our arguments very clearly. So we want to move away from presenting them in this natural language prose form and give them in standard form. Standard form has all of your premises on top and your conclusion on the bottom. These 3 dots that you see next to the conclusion mean therefore, right? It's called a tridot. The tridot means therefore. It just tells us this is the conclusion. Okay? All right, let's look at the next argument. Studies show that smoking increases the risk of lung cancer. Since Gavin is a heavy smoker, it follows that he is at a higher risk of developing lung cancer. Okay, so this is an argument. It's made up of several different sentences. Right? Studies show that smoking increases the risk of lung cancer. That's a sentence. Gavin is a heavy smoker. That could be true or false, so that's a sentence as well. And last, it follows that he is at a higher risk of developing lung cancer. That could also be true or false, right? So it's got 3 different sentences by my count here. What do you think the conclusion is? What's the main point? What are they driving at? Well, here, they also give us a helpful word, right? They give us a conclusion indicator. It follows that, right? So we know that what they say last in the argument here is going to be the conclusion. Now, don't be mistaken in thinking that the conclusion in natural language form is always written at the end. Sometimes when you're writing in natural language, you write the conclusion right up front. Sometimes the conclusion's in the middle. So we still need to ask ourselves, what is the main point here? We still have to go through the process. But in this case, it is correct that the very last sentence is the conclusion. Here's what it looks like in standard form. Right? Studies show that smoking increases the risk of lung cancer. Gavin is a heavy smoker. Therefore, Gavin is at a higher risk of developing lung cancer. Okay, let's look at the next argument. It likely rained recently, since the grass outside is wet and the sky is still cloudy. Okay, what are they trying to convince us of? That it rained recently, right? Or rather, that it's likely it rained recently. How do we know that? Well, again, there is this premise indicator, since. Since tells us what comes after is going to be a premise, right? The grass outside is wet and the sky is still cloudy. Okay, so in this case, the conclusion is going to be it likely rained recently. Now, I have here the premise as a single sentence. If you broke the premises up into 2 separate sentences, that's also acceptable. Right? Instead of saying the grass outside is wet and the sky is still cloudy, you might have said the grass outside is wet. Next line, the sky is still cloudy. That's perfectly acceptable. Okay, last one. If Quincy is going to the party, so is Jody. Since Jody is not going to the party, that means that Quincy isn't going either. Okay. What do you think the conclusion is here? What's the main point that they're trying to make? Quincy isn't going to the party, right? Quincy isn't going either. So, how do we give it in standard form? List the premises up top, and then the conclusion. If Quincy is going to the party, so is Jody. Jody is not going to the party. Therefore, Quincy is not going to the party. Okay. So hopefully now you have the basics of seeing what an argument is, right? Recognizing an argument when you see one. And hopefully you're starting to build this skill of picking out premises and conclusions. All right, let's move on to evaluating arguments. So within the scope of this class, the primary method by which we're going to be evaluating arguments is going to be testing them for validity. So validity is a crucial concept. In fact, it might be the most crucial concept that you will learn in this class altogether, right? So you really need to get this one. Validity means that an argument's premises guarantee the argument's conclusion. Said another way, an argument is valid if, when all the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. Okay? Again, if all of the argument's premises are true, then the conclusion would have to be true. A couple things to note here. That does not mean that the premises really need to be true. Okay? Validity just says if the premises were true, the conclusion would have to be. Okay? So you might have a valid argument that has a false conclusion. You might have a valid argument that has false premises, right? Just so long as you don't have true premises and a false conclusion, that's fine. Okay? Validity is a way of relating the premises to the conclusion. Okay? It's just about the structure. It's not about what the different sentences in the argument say. It doesn't really matter at all what those sentences say, so long as they hang together in the right way. Okay, so let's look at a couple of examples here. Here's an argument, already in standard form for us. If the number 3 is odd, then the moon is made of cheese. Premise 2, the number 3 is odd. Conclusion, the moon is made of cheese. Okay, so based on our definition, what do you think about this argument? Is it valid or invalid? Well, this argument, odd as it might seem, is valid. Again, validity doesn't care about how true the premises are, right? It doesn't care whether or not the premises are absurd. It doesn't matter. It's about the structure of the argument. So notice in premise 1, yeah, it's a really bizarre thing to say that the number 3 is somehow related to the moon being made of cheese, right? That's something that's obviously not true, right? But that doesn't matter. In premise 2, we see that there's an affirmation that yes, 3 is odd, and therefore the condition we set up in premise 1 is going to end up producing this conclusion, the moon is made of cheese. Okay? So this is a valid argument, even though it's weird. Okay? What about this? Every mammal is warm-blooded. Therefore, whales are warm-blooded. Is this a valid argument? No. This argument is invalid, even though the premise is true and the conclusion is true, right? It's still invalid. Why? Well, to determine whether an argument's valid or invalid, we'll need a few tools that we'll get later, but right now we can eyeball it. Let's assume that the premise is true. Every mammal is warm-blooded. Let's assume that's true. Is it possible in any world that the conclusion could still be false? Whales are warm-blooded. Yeah, if whales aren't mammals, right? What if whales are fish? They aren't, but what if they were? If whales were fish and not mammals, then that premise, every mammal is warm-blooded, would do nothing at all in terms of supporting our conclusion. So we're missing a premise here. Specifically, we're missing the premise that whales are mammals, right? And without that premise, this argument is invalid. Okay? The conclusion does not follow from the premises. Okay. Let's look at more practice for validity. We've seen these before. Studies show that smoking increases the risk of lung cancer. Gavin is a heavy smoker. Therefore, Gavin is at a higher risk of developing lung cancer. So let's assume that both premises are true. Studies do show that smoking increases the risk of lung cancer. And, as a matter of fact, Gavin is a heavy smoker. Does it follow from the truth of those two things that Gavin is at a higher risk of developing lung cancer? Well, not necessarily, right? It might be that studies show that that's the case, but the studies are wrong. That's possible, right? If that's the case, then this argument is invalid, okay? It doesn't actually show that the conclusion is true, right? The conclusion doesn't have to be true just because the premises are. What about this one? The grass outside is wet and the sky is still cloudy. Therefore, it likely rained recently. Let's imagine that the premise is true. The grass outside is wet and the sky is still cloudy. Does that mean it must be the case that it likely rained recently? No, clearly not, right? It might be that your neighbor had their sprinkler on too long. And it might be that it's cloudy because it's about to rain, but it hasn't rained yet, right? If that's the case, then there's no reason to assume it's likely it rained recently at all, right? So this is another invalid argument. The conclusion does not necessarily follow from the premises. What about this? If Quincy is going to the party, so is Jody. Premise 2, Jody is not going to the party. Conclusion, Quincy is not going to the party. You think this is valid or invalid? Well, this one is valid. We don't know anything about Quincy and Jody and their party, but we do know that if Quincy's going, Jody must also be going, right? So since Jody is not going, we can infer that Quincy is not going. This is a type of argument that we call modus tollens for short, right? Or denying the consequent. These aren't things you need to remember right now, but we will see them much later, right? They're key kinds of arguments within standard modern logic, okay? This one is valid. If those two premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true. Has to be. All right. Now, there is one more way that we can evaluate the kinds of arguments we're going to be looking at in this class, and that's to see whether the argument is sound. Okay? Now, a sound argument has two ingredients. First, it's valid, right? So only valid arguments can be sound. Second, all of the argument's premises are true. So a sound argument is a valid argument with all true premises. Now, what follows out of that is that the conclusion has to be true as well, right? Because a valid argument says that the premises guarantee the truth of the conclusion, and if the premises are true, what does that mean? Well, the conclusion has to be true as well, okay? So, let's look at the following argument we saw earlier. If the number 3 is odd, then the moon is made of cheese. The number 3 is odd, therefore, the moon is made of cheese. Earlier, we decided this was a valid argument. However, we can now see that it's clearly not sound. Why? Well, because premise 1 is false. There's no reason to think that the number 3's being odd has anything at all to do with planetary bodies being made of cheese, right? There's no reason to think that there's a relationship there at all. So this is an unsound argument, even though it is valid. Okay? What about this? It's also an argument we've seen earlier, but now updated. every mammal is warm-blooded. Premise 2, whales are mammals. Therefore, whales are warm-blooded. Now that we've included that second premise, this argument is valid. Great. Is it sound? Yes. The first premise, every mammal is warm-blooded, is true as a matter of fact. And 2, whales are mammals, that's also true as a matter of fact. Therefore, it has to be true that whales are warm-blooded. This is a valid and sound argument. Now, in this class, we're going to be talking about validity nearly exclusively, right? Checking for soundness kind of goes beyond the scope of logic, right? Checking for soundness has to do with gathering evidence, going out and doing science or another form of investigation or inquiry, maybe doing some philosophy, right? We aren't really going to be doing that in this class, but it's important to note that validity is not the only measure of an argument's success. Okay? So just because we're going to be saying that some arguments are valid and some aren't, doesn't mean that we are saying this argument is altogether good, right? A valid argument is not necessarily a true argument, right? Okay. Now, last thing about evaluating arguments. Some arguments can't be evaluated in the way we've just done, right? These are typically inductive arguments. So an inductive argument is one that's trying to promote the likelihood of its conclusion. It's not trying to say anything for certain. It's trying to say that its conclusion is likely. So if you're trying to say your conclusion is likely, you're definitely not going to be able to say that the premises guarantee your conclusion. So it's simply wrong to evaluate an inductive argument based on validity. It's always going to be an invalid argument. That doesn't mean it's a bad argument. For induction, arguments are either strong, which means that their premises do grant a great degree of likelihood to their conclusion, or they're weak, in which case their premises don't really provide any kind of evidentiary support for their conclusion at all. So we can look at the following argument that we've seen earlier. The grass outside is wet, and the sky is still cloudy. Therefore, it likely rained recently. Well, now we can see that even though this argument was invalid, it might still be a decent inductive argument. Because there's still a lot of possibilities for, explaining why the grass outside is wet and the sky is cloudy. This is not going to be particularly strong, but it's also not going to be particularly weak either. It's a perfectly reasonable hypothesis. It's probably somewhere around the middle of the road. Now, we aren't really going to be talking about inductive arguments in this class. It's important that you know the difference between deductive arguments and inductive arguments, but we're not really going to be studying inductive arguments. Okay? This class is all about deduction. If you want to know more about induction, look into probability, right? That's a really good way of trying to handle inductive arguments. Okay, we're going to end by looking at some common mistakes regarding what we've discussed thus far. So, first, just because an argument has a conclusion that's true, it doesn't follow that the argument is valid. Oftentimes, beginners in logic will see an argument that, quote unquote, looks good, right? It has a conclusion that either they think is obviously true or something they personally agree with, and so they think that the argument must be valid. This likely stems from a confusion of terms. Validity in the colloquial notion, meaning something like reasonable, something like that, is not at all what we're doing here. Again, validity is a test of the structure of an argument. It says an argument is valid if and only if the premises would guarantee the conclusion. That's it, right? So it's possible to have an argument with a true conclusion that is nevertheless invalid. It's possible to have an argument that has all true premises and a true conclusion and still be invalid. Let's look at the following example. Premise 1, ants have 6 legs. Premise 2, ants are insects. Conclusion, insects have 6 legs. Okay? All of these statements, these sentences, are true. They're all true. Ants do have 6 legs. Ants are insects. And insects do have 6 legs. But this argument is still invalid. Why? Well, it's because if we assume that those two premises are true, that doesn't necessarily lead us to the conclusion. We can't get to the conclusion from these two premises. Just because ants are insects and ants have 6 legs, that doesn't tell us anything about all insects, right? That doesn't tell us anything about the fact that insects, by definition, have to have 6 legs. So don't be confused when you see an argument that looks reasonable because you know all of the components are true. Don't be tricked into thinking that it must then be valid. That's not necessarily the case. Now let's look at this other argument. Right? Wednesday is Thursday. On Wednesday, pigs can fly. Therefore, on Thursday, pigs can fly. Now this argument should clock as unreasonable just immediately, right? Well, this is an absurd thing to say. Wednesday is Thursday? Why would anyone ever say that, right? On Wednesday, pigs can fly? This is just absurd, right? This is all unreasonable, seemingly, right? So again, don't be confused here. Yes, these are independently unreasonable things to say. Nevertheless, the premises do support the conclusion. If these premises, unreasonable as they are, were true, the conclusion would have to be true. Let's assume it is the case that Wednesday is Thursday. Bizarre, but okay, right? Wednesday is Thursday. Well, if Wednesday is Thursday, and on Wednesday pigs really can fly, then yeah, it pretty clearly follows that on Thursday pigs can fly. So this is a valid argument that has all false premises and a false conclusion. Still, it's valid. Okay? So don't make the mistake of conflating truth in our world or reasonability in our world with validity. Okay? Validity is merely a test of the structure of an argument. Do the premises actually support the conclusion, or don't they? If they don't, the argument's invalid. If they do, then the argument is valid. Okay, so that's all I have for you this week. Next week, we're going to start with categorical logic. So logic that has to do with classes of things, like insects, ants, pigs, etc., and how they relate to one another. So we're going to dive in with some real logic next week. Until then, stay healthy, stay safe.